anatomy class, this is video 6. In video 6 we're talking about the superficial muscles of the back and shoulders. So that's the deltoid, the trapezius, latissimus dorsi, and teres major. So we're going to start out, we'll dive right in by going into the app today, Essentials Anatomy 5. And we'll take a look at the location and shape and attachments of those muscles, and then we'll hit the gym and take a look at some movements.
Okay, we are inside Essential Anatomy 5. This is the app that I like to use, a 3D app that I like to use to look at musculoskeletal anatomy and other anatomy as well. So let's take a look just briefly at some of the skeletal muscle parts that we're going to be kind of in the area of, and what we've already looked at somewhat. So here we can see the scapula and the clavicle, right? So that's the shoulder girdle, the scapula and clavicle. Okay, and we will be looking at muscles, superficial muscles of the back today, and so those muscles are going to attach to some bones that we haven't talked about yet. So one area that we're going to have a muscle attaching to here is the occipital bone. There's the occipital bone. That's the most posterior bone of the skull. We'll also have muscles attaching along the spine, so along the vertebra, and specifically, if we look at a vertebra, we can see the spinous process here. So this area here is the spinous process of this happens to be a thoracic vertebra that we're looking at, and so we'll be seeing muscles attaching there, and then of course ribs. We'll have a little bit of muscle involvement in ribs, and the humerus, which we've already looked at. Let's review the humerus just a little bit here. So here's the proximal end of the humerus. So let's light up the humerus. And so remember those tubercles on the humerus, the greater tubercle and the lesser tubercle, right? Here is the greater tubercle. Here is the lesser tubercle. And remember, what goes in between them is the, right in through here is the bicipital groove, also called the intertubercular groove. So that groove actually is going to come into play with some of the muscles we're looking at today. Not the groove actually so much as the ridges on either side of it. Okay, so let's take a look at muscles. So the first muscle we're going to look at today is the deltoid. Let's start out with looking at all of them, and then we'll go through one by one. So let's add some muscles onto our model here. Okay. So here's the deltoid. This is one muscle we're looking at today, the deltoid. Another we're looking at today is trapezius. And here, when I indicate the trapezius on the app, for whatever reason, it shows it as if it's one muscle. It's not one muscle. There's a right trapezius and a left trapezius. So deltoid, trapezius, latissimus dorsi we're looking at today. Let's fade the others and get a better view of that guy. There's latissimus dorsi, and then its helper muscle, teres major. Okay, those are the muscles we're looking at today. So let's start out with deltoid. Okay, so deltoid is the most superficial muscle of the shoulder. It has, so first of all, what does the name deltoid mean? Deltoid, if we look at it like this, we can see what it means. Deltoid refers to the Greek letter delta, which is essentially a triangle shape. But like if you think about a river delta, you know, where a river feeds out into the ocean, it creates sort of a triangle shape there. Those both a river delta and the deltoid muscle refer to the Greek letter delta, which is a triangle shape. So that's where it gets its name. And so let's look at attachments for the deltoid. So the deltoid actually has three parts of the muscle. So here it more or less looks like one part, but there are three parts. So the deltoid crosses the glenohumeral joint or shoulder joint, therefore it moves the shoulder joint. It has anterior fibers that are these in through here. Those are the anterior fibers. It has middle fibers, which are here inside there, and then it has posterior fibers here. Those are the posterior fibers of deltoid. So deltoid kind of, you can see the way it attaches. It kind of wraps around the shoulder girdle. Let's look at its attachments. So its more proximal attachments that we might call the origin include the lateral clavicle. Specifically, it's the lateral 1/3 of the clavicle. So you can see, let's bring these back here. Maybe not. You can see the clavicle there, right? So the lateral clavicle in through here, and the acromion process right through here, and the spine of the scapula right here. Okay, those are the three attachments, the proximal attachments or the origin of the deltoid. So again, those are the lateral clavicle, the acromion process, and the spine of the scapula. So it wraps around the shoulder girdle, which you can see nicely from above, and has those nice attachments there. Its distal attachment or its insertion should be easy because it's named for the muscle. It's on the humerus, and it is the deltoid tuberosity of the humerus. So that is right about right there on the humerus. If we make the muscles go away, we can, oops. Let's make muscles go away here. There we can see the, let's see. We can see the humerus here, right? And so the deltoid tuberosity on the humerus is right about there. Okay, so those are the attachments of the deltoid. Let's bring the deltoid back. You do see one real thin muscle that's superficial to the deltoid here. This one right here is called platysma. We're not getting to the platysma for a while yet, but the platysma is a very thin muscle that that mostly works in facial expression. So let's see, can we make platysma go away? Yeah, there. So now it's kind of gone, but then there you can see deltoid. Okay, so actions for deltoid. So when we talk about the actions for deltoid, we need to remember that that it has these three distinct parts to it. So it has the anterior fibers, the middle fibers, and the posterior fibers. So when all three sets of fibers work together, the action that deltoid does is abduction of the glenohumeral joint, or abduction of the shoulder. So that is, now I can't make the app move, unfortunately, but you can imagine in this, and we are going to take a look at these movements after we look at the app. But abduction is taking the arm out to the side, away from the midline of the body. So abduction is the action of deltoid when all three sets of fibers are working together. Let's get rid of platysma here. Let's light up deltoid. Okay. And then the rest of the actions of deltoid, we're gonna break down into the anterior fibers or the posterior fibers working by themselves. So when the anterior fibers work by themselves, the anterior fibers, you can see, cross the shoulder joint more anteriorly here, whereas the middle fibers cross the shoulder joint laterally in through here, and the posterior fibers cross the shoulder joint posteriorly. So what that means is the way it sort of cups around the shoulder joint, what that means is that the deltoid can move the shoulder in a lot of different directions. And so the anterior fibers do flexion, shoulder flexion, shoulder or glenohumeral medial rotation, and horizontal adduction. Now in your book, what I call horizontal adduction, your book calls horizontal flexion. But the idea is that it's moving the arm into that flexion position, but through the horizontal plane. So those are the three actions of the anterior fibers: flexion, shoulder abduction, also called shoulder horizontal adduction, and which is also called shoulder horizontal flexion, and shoulder medial rotation. Those are the three actions of the anterior fibers. Now, while those anterior fibers are doing those actions, the posterior fibers have to actually, if you can imagine this, they have to lengthen to let those anterior fibers do that function. And so the posterior fibers actually have complete opposite actions of the anterior fibers. So this is a concept we haven't talked about yet with muscles. So we did talk about how muscles come in antagonistic pairs. One muscle will do flexion at a joint, and there will be another muscle that will be its antagonist that does extension at that joint. And so sometimes within the same muscle, you can get antagonistic actions, and that's what we have with deltoid. So the anterior fibers and the posterior fibers cross the shoulder joint on opposite sides, and therefore do opposite actions at the shoulder. So we talked about the anterior fibers doing shoulder flexion, the posterior fibers do shoulder extension. So if you can imagine this person moving the arm forward into shoulder flexion, you can imagine these posterior fibers lengthening while that happens. So if they're lengthening, that one of the things that means is that they need to relax to allow that action to happen, and that's one of the things that antagonistic pairs do, is when one is working, the other relaxes to not resist the work that one is doing. And but we could also say that the antagonistic pair, or the antagonistic muscle, or in this case the antagonistic fibers of the same muscle, that those are stretching while its antagonistic partner is working. So while the anterior fibers do shoulder flexion, the posterior fibers are stretching. So anyway, it actually makes the deltoid actions really easy to learn. If we know what the actions of the anterior fibers are, we just turn those actions around, and those are the actions of the posterior fibers. So the opposite action to flexion is extension. So anterior fibers do flexion, posterior fibers do extension. Anterior fibers do medial shoulder rotation, posterior fibers do lateral shoulder rotation. Anterior fibers do horizontal adduction or horizontal flexion. Posterior fibers do horizontal abduction or horizontal extension. Let me just double check. Yes, horizontal extension is what your book calls it. Okay, so that makes sense. So it's kind of a lot of actions. It's 7 actions for this muscle, but they're pretty easy to learn. So when all fibers are working together, the action for the muscle is abduction. So that's middle fibers working with anterior fibers and posterior fibers. And then when we isolate the fibers, anterior fibers do shoulder flexion, shoulder medial rotation, shoulder horizontal adduction or horizontal flexion, and posterior fibers do shoulder extension, shoulder lateral rotation, and shoulder horizontal abduction or horizontal extension. Okay, so that's deltoid. Let's take a look at our next muscle, which is trapezius. So again, like I mentioned, trapezius strangely shows up on here as if it is one muscle, but it is not. There's a right trapezius and a left trapezius. And so the name trapezius refers to the shape of the muscle. So it's a trapezoid shape, and that's what its name is referring to. Attachments for trapezius. So the entire muscle, there are a lot of attachments. As you can see, it's a big muscle. And you can see also that it has fibers that are going in different directions. So let's actually start with the insertion of trapezius, because we just left off with deltoid. So if we remember the origin of deltoid, or the proximal attachment of deltoid, so deltoid was the lateral 1/3 of the clavicle, the acromion process, and the spine of the scapula. So if we remember those attachment sites, that's exactly where trapezius attaches, but deltoid attaches to the underneath of those structures, and trapezius attaches to the top of them. So again, let's fade these others so we can see trapezius here. So that's the insertion of trapezius. It is, again, the lateral 1/3 of the clavicle. It's actually a little more for trapezius, but the lateral clavicle, the acromion process, and the spine of the scapula. Exact attachments of deltoid, only it's the insertion for trapezius and it's the origin for deltoid. Okay, so that one's pretty easy. So if we, when we're learning muscles, one of the great tricks is to kind of connect these dots, right? So trapezius and deltoid, we can kind of connect them to each other, knowing that they attach to the same bones. And in a sense, are continuous. The fibers are like a continuation in a way, right? So, excuse me. So like these fibers, if we continue down, we have one chain of movement that happens there. All right, let's get back to trapezius. All right, so our other attachments for trapezius. So in the book, it lists the external occipital protuberance. What the heck is that? That is part of the occiput that I had mentioned earlier. Let's make these guys go away. So right here on, let's see, on the occipital bone, to indicate the occipital bone here. The external occipital protuberance is right there on the occipital bone. It's also called the inion. That's another name for it. It's a bump on the back of the head. You most likely can feel your external occipital protuberance. So that is one attachment place. And now on this occipital bone, can you see this line across here? A line across there on that side. That's called the nuchal line. It's called the nuchal line because a ligament attaches there, and the ligament that attaches there is called the nuchal ligament. Let's see if we can make that show up here. There it is. So let's make the occipital bone go away, and let's look at the nuchal ligament. So the nuchal ligament kind of fills in, it's connective tissue. So ligament, of course, connects bone to bone, and so is not directly, it's not part of a muscle. It's more part of the skeletal system. But the nuchal ligament fills in this space from the kind of the underside of the occiput to C7. C7 is this spinous process right there, cervical vertebra number 7. So the nuchal ligament is this thing here that fills in that whole space. So you can see that the spinous processes of the cervical vertebra are quite anterior to the spinous process of C7, and then the thoracic spinous processes down from there. And so the nuchal ligament's job is to be sort of this extension of those spinous processes, because there are a lot of muscles that need to attach in the cervical region, and the nuchal ligament, part of what it's doing is providing more surface area for muscle attachment. And trapezius, being a very superficial muscle, let's see how the ligament disappears if we look at it posteriorly. and then it reappears when we come around and look at it at the side. Trapezius being a very superficial muscle, it has to attach to the most superficial attachments that there are. It can't go in deep to get to the bones that a lot of other muscles are attached to anyway. And so the nuchal ligament is kind of this helper tissue that gives the trapezius something to attach to. Okay, so let's put some muscles back on here. And there's trapezius. So once we have trapezius on, we can't see the nuchal ligament anymore. But if we take it away, there it is. So you can kind of get a sense of where it's attaching in there. Okay, so attachments for trapezius. The nuchal line, the nuchal ligament, so remember the nuchal line is this line across the occiput here. The nuchal ligament is this ligament that is indicated there in green. So the nuchal line, the nuchal ligament, the external occipital protuberance. I'm happy if you just know nuchal line and nuchal ligament for its attachments. Let's see what else. And then the spinous processes of C7 to T12. So, oops, make that go away. The spinous processes of C7 to T12. Let's get rid of some muscles and we'll look at those bones. Okay. So the spinous processes, remember that's the part that sticks out the most posteriorly. That's the spinous process. Right there is the spinous process of C7. And trapezius is going to attach to the spinous process of C7, C8, C9, C10, C11, and C12. Sorry, what did I just say? C7, okay, C7, T1, T2, T3, T4, T5, T6, T7, oops. Sorry, I gotta make the pen go away to move this. Down to T12. So T12 is thoracic vertebra 12. Let's get rid of some more muscles so we can see it a little better. And let's get rid of the connective tissue. So there we can see here is rib 12 right here. And so the vertebra that rib 12 attaches to is T12. So there's thoracic vertebra 12. Okay, so the spinous processes from C7 to T12. That's the attachment for trapezius. So it seems like a lot of attachments, but it's not really difficult to remember. If we basically think about that trapezius is the most superficial muscle of the upper back, it needs to attach to the most superficial aspect of the vertebra, which is the spinous processes, and so basically that's what it's doing, attaching to the spinous processes from C7 to T12, and then it would continue attaching to the spinous processes through the cervical region, but it can't reach them, and so it attaches to the nuchal ligament instead in that region. And then it goes all the way up and attaches to the occiput, which is, arguably we could say actually that the occiput is a highly modified vertebra, and that the external occipital protuberance is actually the remnant of this highly modified vertebra of a spinous process. Therefore, that makes the attachments of trapezius extremely easy to remember. It just attaches to the spinous processes, starting at the occiput, going through the cervical vertebra where it can't reach the spinous processes, so it attaches to the nuchal ligament, and then continuing down where it can reach the spinous processes from C7 to T12. All right, let's get trapezius back here and take a look at its different sets of fibers. Oops. Let's get rid of that. And, okay, there's trapezius. Okay, so there are 3 sets of fibers in trapezius, just like in deltoid there were 3 sets of fibers. So in trapezius we have upper fibers that are up through here. We have middle fibers that go across like this. And then we have lower fibers, or inferior, lower, upper, middle, lower fibers. Okay, so we can see that these fibers kind of run in different directions. So upper fibers and lower fibers, if we kind of continue these lines, what we see is that they are more or less a 90-degree angle from each other. So what that's going to mean is we're going to see some opposite actions from the upper fibers versus the lower fibers. So like in deltoid, we're going to see opposing actions in this one muscle. And then the middle fibers going this way are going to have some different actions. All right, so let's take a look at actions of trapezius. I'll just take a look at the ones in the book here, and then when we are looking at a real moving body, hopefully it will make total sense. So for trapezius, actions include elevation of the scapula, retraction of the scapula, and upward rotation of the scapula. So I'll show you what those look like when we have a moving person. So those are actions that the upper fibers are doing. Elevation of the scapula, retraction of the scapula, and upward rotation. Remember, we also called upward rotation lateral rotation of the scapula. And then middle fibers do retraction of the scapula, and lower fibers do depression of the scapula. So on trapezius, I just want you to learn the names that are, or the actions that are in bold. And then, so we are learning some of the reverse mover actions of trapezius, because these are common actions of trapezius also. So trapezius upper fibers extend the head and neck. So remember what extension of the head and neck look like. So it's tipping the head back as if you're looking up at the sky. That's extension of the head and neck. And then it contralaterally rotates the head and neck at the spinal joints. So it's going to turn the head contralaterally, meaning that if the right upper fibers of trapezius are contracting, it's going to turn the head to face the left. That's a contralateral rotation. And then the third action, the third reverse mover action, is lateral flexion of the head and neck. So that's our ear to shoulder action. It's lateral flexion. Okay, so those are the actions of trapezius. Let's take a look at Latissimus dorsi. Latissimus dorsi. So what does this muscle, what does the name of this muscle mean? It means latissimus, lat means side. Latissimus, so, or it actually means wide, and dorsi refers to back. And so this is a wide muscle of the back. It is not the most superficial muscle because trapezius overlaps it just a little bit right in through here. But for the most, where they're not overlapping, it's the most superficial muscle. It's definitely the most superficial muscle of the low back. So it's this wide back muscle that goes up into the axillary region and it moves the arm. So let's take a look at attachments for Latissimus dorsi. Its attachments include spinous processes of T7 through L5. So starting at T7, and there's that overlap between trapezius and Latissimus dorsi. Trapezius was coming down all the way to T12. Latissimus dorsi begins at T7, so they overlap a few vertebrae there. So the spinous processes of T7 down to L5, so through the entire lumbar region. There are 5 lumbar vertebrae, and Latissimus dorsi attaches to all of those, and it's the spinous processes. So the spinous processes of T7 to L5, the posterior sacrum, so it goes down further than the lumbar spine, so it goes down into the sacrum, which you can see here. So here's the sacrum in through there, and Latissimus dorsi is attaching there, and the posterior iliac crest. So this is another thing that we haven't really looked specifically at yet, but the posterior iliac crest is this along here. So that's like the hip bone region, and it attaches there. Okay, so spinous processes of T7 to L5 the posterior sacrum, and then the posterior iliac crest. That's the origin of Latissimus dorsi. The insertion is kind of interesting. So when we look at Latissimus dorsi, one of the things we have to keep in mind, we have to understand to be able to make sense of the movements that it does, is we have to see how it goes through the armpit region. So let's see, let's bring back the other muscles. So see how in through here, it's heading up into the axillary region, and then we see its insertion here. It inserts on the humerus, and specifically on the humerus, where it inserts is the medial lip of the bicipital groove. So remember, the bicipital groove is that groove in between the greater and the lesser tubercle of the humerus, and this is in Latissimus dorsi is inserting on the medial lip of the bicipital groove. So when the fibers of Latissimus dorsi contract, it's going to pull the medial lip of the bicipital groove, or we could say more general, it's going to pull that humerus closer to its attachments in the low back. So what does that mean? What actions do we get? So our standard mover actions for Latissimus dorsi include medial rotation of the shoulder, or medial rotation of the arm at the glenohumeral joint. So can you picture that? How if these fibers pull and shorten, it's going to medially rotate the arm at the shoulder. So medial rotation. Adduction. So Latissimus dorsi crosses the shoulder joint underneath the shoulder joint, right? Whereas deltoid, when we were looking at deltoid crosses over the top of the shoulder joint. Latissimus dorsi crosses underneath. So deltoid did abduction, so pulled the arm out away from the torso. What do you think Latissimus dorsi is going to do? It's going to do a deduction and pull the arm back down toward the torso. So actions again then for Latissimus dorsi: medial rotation of the shoulder, adduction of the arm at the shoulder or at the glenohumeral joint. So adduction is that movement in the frontal plane, bringing the arm down toward the side, so moving the arm toward midline. And then the third action is extension of the arm at the glenohumeral joint. So imagine the arm is in a flexion position and we bring it back down into anatomical position, that's extension. So it seems a little weird that we have this very big, very strong muscle, and it does these actions that well, at least the actions of adduction and extension, those are actions that gravity would do anyway, right? So why would we need this big, strong muscle to do that? So Latissimus dorsi is not working hard when we're just doing adduction or just doing extension. So it's more the some of the other actions, or it's more, let's see, how do we describe this? It's more that when we're moving the torso or moving the whole body, and the arms are stable, or the arms may be moving too, but there's less movement there, that Latissimus dorsi works. So if you think about going to the gym and you say to the trainer, I really want to build my lats, they're going to have you do an exercise called lat pull downs. And so lat pull downs are using Latissimus dorsi, and it's like grabbing a bar above your head and pulling it down with a wide grip. And so if you're pulling down with a wide grip, essentially what you're doing is adduction, depending on how your arms are situated, but essentially what you're doing in that action is adduction. And so you can pull a very strong weight down toward you doing adduction. Conversely, you can pull your whole entire body up to a bar or to some surface using Latissimus dorsi. So that is why we have this big strong muscle of the low back that attaches to the arm, is so that we can say we're in the mountains and we're climbing up on rocks, we can put our grip up high and hold on to something and pull our entire body up to that point. And so whether we're doing it where the arm is doing adduction or the arm is doing extension, that's latissimus dorsi working. So latissimus dorsi, very big, very strong muscle that moves the body, really. That's kind of where it shines, is when the whole body is moving. Okay, the last muscle we're looking at today is teres major. Teres major is a small helper muscle to latissimus dorsi. Teres major, let's find this guy. So let's look at it over here on this side. And let's fade some of these. So it's teeny tiny, right? In comparison to latissimus dorsi, teres major is a fairly small muscle, but it is a helper of latissimus dorsi. And so it doesn't anchor down in the low back the way latissimus dorsi does, but it does attach very similarly. So let's look at, first of all, what does teres major mean? The word teres means round and major means larger. So whenever we see a muscle called something major, we know that somewhere in that vicinity there's going to be another muscle with the same name but minor. So there will be a teres minor muscle that we'll look at. That's one of the rotator cuff muscles. So this is the first teres muscle that we're looking at. This one's called teres major. So it's kind of funny that we're looking at it as a helper to latissimus dorsi, and and it's a very small muscle as compared to latissimus dorsi, but its name is major because teres minor is smaller than teres major is. Excuse me. All right, attachments for teres major. So we have the inferior angle and the lateral border of the scapula. So you can see the scapula here, and teres major attaches here on the lateral border of the scapula, and it's the lower part of the lateral. So we could think of it as the lower half of the lateral border of the scapula, and it goes all the way down to the inferior angle. And then the insertion of teres major, whoops, pen, is right around here. It's the medial lip of the bicipital groove. Oh, that sounds familiar, doesn't it? The medial lip of the bicipital groove. Didn't we already have a muscle attaching there? Yes, we did. What muscle was it? It was latissimus dorsi. Here's latissimus dorsi. There it is, attaching to the medial lip of the bicipital groove. Okay, let's make it go away. See that attachment? And then let's look at, we got to turn around though to get to teres major. And there it is, attaching to the medial lip of the bicipital groove. So they're right next to each other, attaching, in a very similar place on the same bone, and coming from a similar place in the back. So latissimus dorsi in some texts is given credit for attaching somewhat to the scapula also. So let's go back though to teres major. Teres major, actions. So actions for teres major. So teres major goes through the armpit the same way that latissimus dorsi does. So it starts in the back and then goes anteriorly to attach to the front of the humerus. And so if it's going to rotate the humerus, how's it going to do it? It's going to do medial rotation. So medial rotation of the arm at the shoulder, or shoulder medial rotation, or medial rotation at the glenohumeral joint, is one action of teres major. The next action is adduction of the arm at the glenohumeral joint, so adduction. And then the third action is extension of the arm at the glenohumeral joint. Wow, those three actions sound familiar, don't they? Medial rotation of the arm at the shoulder, adduction of the arm at the shoulder, and extension of the arm at the shoulder. Those are the exact same three actions as what muscle? Anyone? Latissimus dorsi. So that's why I call it a helper muscle to latissimus dorsi, because it has the same three actions on the shoulder. Latissimus dorsi, of course, much stronger. So latissimus dorsi has the capacity to move the whole body much more than teres major does. In latissimus dorsi, I didn't talk about some of these other actions that latissimus dorsi does, but latissimus dorsi can also move at the other end, right? So when it does that, and it's moving from down here, we're going to get actions like an anterior pelvic tilt. You know, or if we isolate on one side, an elevation of the pelvis. I'll show you what those look like. So, okay, those are our three muscles. I think that's enough looking at the app today, but let's just review them one more time. We looked at deltoid today. We looked at, let's back up here, and actually let's do this too. Let's look at it on the female for a minute. Okay, so here's deltoid, here's trapezius, here's latissimus dorsi, and here's teres major. Those are our four muscles for this video. And then now let's take a look at some movements. Okay, here we are in the gym so that we can take a look at the movements that these muscles do. So deltoid, our first muscle, actions for deltoid. When all three fibers of deltoid work together, so anterior fibers, middle fibers, and posterior fibers. Let me back up a little bit so you can see more of my arm. When all three sets of fibers work together, abduction is the action. So shoulder abduction is what deltoid does. Shoulder abduction. Okay, so this is shoulder abduction. So abduction is movement in the frontal or coronal plane, and it's movement away from the midline of the body, shoulder abduction. So that's all three sets of fibers of deltoid working together. If we isolate anterior fibers, we get shoulder flexion. On this side, shoulder flexion. So shoulder flexion, shoulder horizontal adduction, which the book calls horizontal flexion. So it's bringing it into a flexion position, but through a horizontal plane. And shoulder medial rotation. So medial rotation, it's kind of hard to see even if I do this here. Medial rotation. Okay, so it's the shoulder that's rotating here. The elbow is not doing anything, it's just fixed. And there's a medial rotation happening at the glenohumeral joint. Okay, so all three sets of fibers for deltoid, abduction. Anterior fibers of deltoid, shoulder flexion, shoulder horizontal flexion or horizontal adduction, and shoulder medial rotation, or like this, shoulder medial rotation. Posterior fibers of deltoid, exact opposite movements of the anterior fibers. So anterior fibers do shoulder flexion, posterior fibers do shoulder extension. Anterior fibers did shoulder abduction, adduction. Posterior fibers do shoulder abduction. Or also in the book called horizontal extension. Anterior fibers did medial rotation, posterior fibers do lateral rotation of the shoulder. And remember, all of these actions, we could say these are actions of the shoulder, we could say they're actions of or at the glenohumeral joint, or actions of the arm at the glenohumeral joint. So there's a number of ways to say it, but if we just say abduction, that doesn't really mean as much as saying shoulder abduction, right? Okay, so that's deltoid. Let's look at trapezius. So actions of trapezius. So trapezius has 1,000 actions, but hopefully these are all going to be nice and clear. So let's actually, on these, start with the reverse mover actions. So remember what the reverse mover actions are actions where, let's see, where essentially they're actions where the insertion, or sorry, the origin part of the muscle is moving. Whereas typically the origin is fixed and the insertion is moving. The other term for those are closed chain movements. So they're called both things, but on the list of actions in your book, they're called reverse mover actions. So, but the other term is closed. Oh, no, I guess it's a little different than closed chain. Reverse mover actions is where the origin is moving. Okay, all right, reverse mover actions. So for trapezius, reverse mover actions, extension of the head and neck at the spinal joint. So extension of the head and neck, what does that look like? Looks like this. Extension of the head and neck. This is flexion of the head and neck. So we're stretching trapezius, or especially upper fibers of trapezius if we're doing that. If we're doing this, the attachments are getting closer to each other and we're doing extension. So extension of the head and neck. So when upper fibers of trapezius do extension of the head and neck, in order for that to happen, both the right and left trapezius are working together to create that extension. So the attachments at the at the occiput are getting closer to the attachments along the spine. And so that's our action, but both the right and the left are doing that together. Therefore, this is a bilateral action. So extension of the head and neck at the spinal joints for upper fibers of trapezius is a reverse mover action, and it is a bilateral action. So both right and left are working at the same time for that action to happen. So another action of the upper fibers of trapezius that is a reverse mover action is contralateral rotation of the head and neck at the spinal joint. So what the heck does that mean? A contralateral rotation. So our attachments for trapezius, remember, they attach, trapezius attaches at the occiput and along the nuchal ligament, and then out here, trapezius attaches at the lateral clavicle, the acromion process, and the spine of the scapula. So, of course, whenever a muscle is doing its action, those attachment sites are getting closer to each other. And here we're just looking at upper fibers of trapezius. And so, one of the actions we're going to be looking at for upper fibers of trapezius is elevation of the scapula, right? And so that's pretty clear, isn't it? That these attachments are getting closer to these attachments when that happens. But with a reverse mover action, these attachments up here at the head are going to get closer to these attachments. So one way we can do that is a rotation. So the attachments at the occiput at the back of the head are getting closer to the attachments at in the shoulder region when I do that rotation, okay? And so why is it called a contralateral rotation? It's called that because when the right upper trapezius is doing the action, when that's the one that's contracting to make this rotation, the head turns to face the left. That's a contralateral rotation, okay? The head turns to face the left when the right muscle is working. It's a rotation. It's a contralateral rotation. We'll see examples of ipsilateral rotations later on. And our third one is laterally flexing. Oh, so a rotation always has to be a unilateral action, although muscles on opposite sides of the body can be working together to create a rotation. But we had talked about the extension action being a bilateral action. Rotation in this case is a unilateral action. And then our last action is laterally flexing the head and neck at the spinal joints. So same thing, we're going to take our attachments at the occiput and our attachments at the acromion, or the lateral clavicle, the acromion process, and the spine of the scapula. They're going to come closer to each other because a muscle always shortens when it does its actions. So if we do lateral flexion, those attachments are getting closer to each other, right? The occiput is getting closer to the shoulder. So lateral flexion of the head and neck at the spinal joints. So those are three reverse mover actions of the upper fibers of trapezius. So in other words, they're actions that happen when the insertion is fixed and the origin is moving. So those three again: extension of the head and neck, contralateral rotation of the head and neck. So here this is just the right side is working. Extension was a bilateral action. And lateral flexion of the head and neck at the spinal joints. Those are our reverse mover actions of the upper fibers of trapezius. And now let's look at standard mover actions. And so those are ones where the insertion is the moving part and the origin is more fixed. So and we'll separate these into upper fibers, middle fibers, and lower fibers, because in trapezius they do work fairly separately from each other. Which, they do in deltoid too. If we're talking about, shoulder flexion and shoulder extension, anterior fibers are working, opposite posterior fibers. What do we call that? Remember the term for that? Anterior fibers, or, whatever. Any muscle does one thing and another muscle does the opposite action. Those are antagonists. Okay, so in deltoid, for example, in shoulder flexion and shoulder extension, anterior fibers and posterior fibers are working antagonistically to each other, and we're going to see that same thing in trapezius. Okay, so trapezius, standard mover actions, upper fibers, elevation of the scapula. And so remember in your book it says elevation of the scapula at the SCC joint, which is the scapulocostal joint, which I don't really consider a joint. I just say that those are movements of the shoulder girdle. So elevation of the scapula, retraction of the scapula. So in retraction of the scapula is
more of an action of the middle fibers of trapezius, but upper fibers do participate in that. Upward rotation of the scapula. Remember what that one looks like? So upward rotation of the scapula, we have to start with the arm out, and even though it looks like it's a shoulder movement, it's not a shoulder movement. What's happening here, remember my hand here is mirroring the scapula that you can't see behind me, and it turns to rotate like that. That's upward rotation. So upper fibers of trapezius are contracting and doing that. So they're creating that turn of the scapula. So those are our upper fiber actions of trapezius, our standard mover actions. Middle fibers of trapezius, retraction of the scapula. So those fibers go straight across the back, and they're perfectly aligned to do retraction of the scapula. And then lower fiber actions do depression of the scapula. So we could depress the scapula out of anatomical position. It's easier to start in an elevated position and then depress to return to anatomical position. So those are our actions. Let's see. And your book does also list that lower fibers participate in retraction of the scapula, and they also participate in upward rotation of the scapula. So those are actions of trapezius. Okay, got those? One more time. Let's just run through standard mover actions of trapezius. Upper fibers, elevation of the scapula, retraction of the scapula, and upward rotation of the scapula. Middle fibers, retraction of the scapula, that's what they do, and lower fibers, depression of the scapula. So where was the antagonistic pairing of the fibers in trapezius actions? That's an elevation and depression. So upper fibers do elevation, lower fibers do depression of the scapula. So in that action, they're antagonists. So you might think, well, why does the same muscle why aren't they separate muscles? Or why does the same muscle do two opposite actions? When a muscle does two opposite actions, it actually sets that muscle up to be a really good stabilizer, because that muscle can pull from above and it can pull from below, which means if they pull simultaneously, then the scapula is stable. It's fixed and strongly in the position that it's in, and then other movements can happen at the glenohumeral joint, and the scapula is staying put. Okay, so let's take a look at latissimus dorsi actions. Latissimus dorsi actions, we have basically three actions that I want you to know for latissimus dorsi. And I'm going to not start with the first one that's listed. The second one that's listed is adduction of the arm at the glenohumeral joint. So here, adduction of the arm at the glenohumeral joint. So starting from here and coming down like that, adduction. And extension of the arm at the glenohumeral joint. Okay, extension like that. So those are two really main actions of latissimus dorsi. So remember, latissimus dorsi is this big back muscle that attaches from T7 down to L5 on the spinous processes, and then down into the sacrum and the posterior iliac crest, and it comes up, and remember, it comes through the armpit and attaches to the anterior aspect of the humerus at the medial lip of the bicipital groove. So because it comes through the armpit in that way, and in fact, latissimus dorsi it's what makes the that posterior axillary fold. That's latissimus dorsi. So you can kind of get that sense of it coming through the armpit, and then it's going to go deep in here and attach to the anterior aspect of the humerus. So its third action is a medial rotation, and so if we don't understand this part of it, we don't get that it does medial rotation. But if it comes from the back through this armpit region to attach to the anterior aspect of the humerus, then of course when these fibers shorten, that's the direction things are going to go. We're going to get this medial rotation, okay, of the glenohumeral joint, or at the glenohumeral joint. So let's see. Latissimus dorsi does also do some other actions like of anterior pelvic tilt and elevation of the pelvis. And those are reverse mover actions, which are important actions, but we're early on in our journey in anatomy. And so at this point, what I want you to know is those three movements that I just went through, those glenohumeral joint actions, or the shoulder actions. So those were adduction of the arm at the shoulder or at the glenohumeral joint, extension
of the arm at the glenohumeral joint and medial rotation of the arm at the glenohumeral joint. And let me just say this, I don't mean to confuse anyone. I do try to, do the movements so that you can see them. But when I do medial, medial rotation really ends here. When I try to exaggerate it, I turn it into protraction of the scapula too. So don't let that confuse you. This is medial rotation. I just try to do it enough that you can see it. But I also often overemphasize it. Okay, anyway, medial rotation. Okay, and then remember teres major. What are the 3 actions of teres major? Exact same 3 actions as latissimus dorsi. So extension, shoulder adduction, shoulder medial rotation. Okay, see, I just did it. I did some protraction, medial rotation. All right, so that's easy. Teres major has the same 3 actions as latissimus dorsi. All right, so if all you want to know, if all you want to know is what you really need to know, like what you're going to be tested on, then stop the video here and get onto your homework and get it done. But I just want to give a couple of other examples of sort of, taking these muscles into some real life movements so that we can start to kind of put together a more moving picture of anatomy. So let's go ahead and take a look at some movements. Okay, so let's take a look at some common movements. We're going to look at bench press and we're going to look at push-ups. And in these common movements, what we're going to isolate and look at is what's happening in the shoulder. So one of the actions we're looking at in some of the muscles we're learning right now is shoulder flexion and shoulder extension. So let's take a look. So oftentimes in a bench press, you have your grip real wide. But what I'm going to do here is have a closer grip so that this is clear that this is what's happening. So, so when I lower the weight, shoulder extension is happening, right? And when I push the weight up, shoulder flexion is happening. So here's shoulder extension and here's shoulder flexion. So can you see that? Shoulder extension, shoulder flexion. So let me just sit up and do the same thing. Does this make sense? That so even though I was doing stuff with my elbows, they were moving too, but the same thing. If we just take a look at what's happening at the shoulder, shoulder flexion, shoulder extension, turn it into a bench press, shoulder flexion, shoulder extension, right? Meaning that the movement that's happening here, that this end of my body, that the extremity is moving freely, even though there's a weight with it, the extremity is moving. So let's look at that exact same movement when the extremity is fixed and the torso is moving. So how do we do that? We take a bench press and we turn it upside down. So in the bench press, the bench itself was keeping my torso fixed, and then my arms were moving the weight. So in a push-up, now my arms are fixed, and my torso is the thing that's moving. But if I have my hands in close, we still have the same action happening here, right? So here we have extension, and here we have flexion. We're just looking at the shoulder, nothing else. Here we have flexion of the shoulder, extension of the shoulder. Here we have flexion of the shoulder. But the difference is that with the push-up, it's a closed chain movement, meaning that this end, that my hands are fixed, and the torso, and my torso is the moving part. Okay, so that's a little review of the open chain and closed chain movements. And it's also an example of shoulder flexion and shoulder extension happening in a real. Let's look at another example, an example of an isometric contraction. So let's go over to the rings. Oh, there's a monkey at my rings. Okay. So on the rings, when you're up on the rings, to stabilize like this, we're doing an isometric contraction because the natural thing that wants to happen on the rings is this. You tend to want to splay out and your body tends to want to fall through. And so to keep that from happening, what action am I doing? I'm doing a very strong action because I'm countering gravity pulling my body down through the rings. And so if gravity pulls my body down through the rings, my arms are doing abduction, but I'm not doing I'm not actively doing abduction, right? That's just what happens if you fall through the rings. So to keep from falling through the rings, you have to do adduction. So to stay up, I'm doing an isometric contraction. I'm doing adduction. So Latissimus dorsi is working here to do adduction to keep me in this stable position. And so, but this is an isometric contraction because I'm not going anywhere. Okay, so those are some examples of some of these muscles working to do real movements with a real body and moving things around. Okay, that's it for video 6. So those 4 muscles, deltoid, trapezius, latissimus dorsi, teres major, go study. And I'll see you next video.